Iceberg floats near small village. Residents turn pale when they see what's on it. The peaceful life in Beacon's Rest was punctuated by the rhythm of the sea, the cries of gulls, and the occasional chatter of its close-knit residents. Nestled between rugged cliffs and an expansive bay, the small village had long been a sanctuary for those seeking a quiet existence. Its shores, lined with smooth pebbles and weathered driftwood, were a familiar sight to the townsfolk, who rarely encountered surprises in their daily lives. However, one cold morning in late winter, something extraordinary happened, something that would shake the very foundation of their tranquil routines. As the first rays of sunlight crept over the horizon, a fisherman named Conrad was the first to spot it. Out on his small fishing boat, he squinted against the pale light of dawn. At first, he thought it was just another piece of ice, broken off from the distant glaciers and carried south by the frigid currents. But as his boat drew closer, he realized this was no ordinary chunk of ice. It was immense, a towering mass of frozen brilliance that seemed to glow faintly in the morning light. Conrad quickly returned to shore, his face pale with astonishment. Word of the iceberg spread quickly, and soon a small crowd had gathered along the shoreline. Mothers wrapped in shawls held their curious children close, fishermen leaned on their nets, and shopkeepers left their stores to catch a glimpse. The iceberg floated serenely in the bay, its sheer size dwarfing anything they had seen before. The occasional iceberg wasn't unheard of this far south, but this one was different. It loomed like a frozen mountain, its jagged peaks reaching skyward, its surface glistening in shades of blue and white. Elliot stood among the crowd, his heart pounding with a mixture of excitement and unease. He had lived in Beacon's Rest his entire life, and while he had always dreamed of adventure, the quiet predictability of the village had kept him tethered. Now, as he looked through his binoculars, he felt a flicker of something he hadn't felt in years: wonder. His gaze swept across the surface of the iceberg, tracing its crevices and ridges. Then, something caught his eye. At first, it was just a faint movement, a flicker of shadow against the pale backdrop of ice. Elliot adjusted the focus on his binoculars, his breath catching as he strained to see more clearly. There it was again, a small but unmistakable movement near the summit. It was too large to be a bird, too irregular to be a trick of the light. He lowered the binoculars, his mind racing. Was it a person? An animal? He scanned the crowd around him, but no one else seemed to notice. The murmurs of the villagers swirled around him, their tones shifting from awe to apprehension. "It shouldn't be here," muttered an older man named Walter, his weathered face furrowed in concern. "Ice like that doesn't last this far south. Something's not right." Others nodded in agreement, their expressions reflecting a growing unease. The iceberg was beautiful, yes, but there was something unsettling about its presence. Something that didn't belong. Elliot couldn't tear his eyes away. Whatever he had seen on the iceberg, it had been real, and it had moved. He felt a strange pull, a magnetic force urging him to learn more. While the villagers began to drift back to their homes, their initial excitement fading into nervous whispers, Elliot lingered. He clutched his binoculars tightly, his thoughts a whirlwind of curiosity and doubt. Should he tell someone? Would they even believe him? And what if he was wrong? By the time the crowd had dispersed, leaving the beach eerily quiet, Elliot had made up his mind. He had to know. Whatever was on that iceberg, whatever had moved, it was calling to him. And he wasn't the kind of person who could ignore a call like that. Back at his small house on the edge of the village, Elliot's mind buzzed with plans. The iceberg wasn't far from the shore, but reaching it wouldn't be easy. He knew he'd need a boat to get there and climbing gear to scale its icy surface. His brother-in-law Nathan owned a small speedboat for fishing trips, and Elliot knew he could borrow it without too many questions. As for the climbing gear, there was only one place to get it: Alden's General Store. The store sat on the corner of Beacon's Rest's only main road, its wooden sign creaking in the cold wind. Inside, the smell of salt and old wood greeted Elliot as he stepped through the door. Mrs. Alden, A sharp-eyed woman in her 60s looked up from behind the counter. She raised an eyebrow as Elliot approached, her gaze falling to the list he held in his hand. "Climbing gear?" she asked, her tone laced with skepticism. "What on earth do you need that for?" Elliot hesitated, his heart racing. He hadn't expected her to question him so directly. Just thought I'd do some exploring," he said, trying to sound casual. "You know, up in the hills." Mrs. Alden narrowed her eyes. "In the hills? This time of year?" She leaned forward slightly, her expression shifting from skepticism to concern. "This wouldn't have anything to do with that iceberg, would it?" Elliot's stomach tightened. Of course, she had heard about it. Everyone had. He tried to play it cool, shrugging nonchalantly. "I mean, it's an interesting sight," he said. "Figured I might take a closer look." Mrs. Alden shook her head, her expression turning stern. "Listen, Elliot, I've known you since you were a boy, and I know you've got a taste for adventure. But that iceberg, it's not safe. You don't know what you're getting into." Her words struck a chord, but they didn't deter him. If anything, they only fueled his resolve. "I appreciate the concern, Mrs. Alden," he said, his voice steady, "but I've made up my mind. I'm going with or without the gear. So, are you going to sell it to me or not?" The storekeeper sighed, her sharp eyes softening slightly. "You're as stubborn as your father was," she muttered, turning to retrieve the items on his list. "Fine, but don't say I didn't warn you." As Elliot left the store, his bag filled with ropes, crampons, and ice axes, he couldn't shake the feeling that his actions had set something in motion, something he couldn't yet understand. Back at his house, he packed quickly, his mind focused on the journey ahead. But just as he was about to head for the harbor, a sharp knock at the door froze him in his tracks. Through the window, he saw the unmistakable silhouette of a police car parked in front of his house. Panic flared in his chest. Mrs. Alden must have called them, warning them of his plans. He heard the knock again, louder this time, accompanied by a voice. "Elliot, open up!" His mind raced. He couldn't let them stop him, not when he was so close. Moving quickly, he slipped out the back door and into the alley behind his house. The narrow paths and hidden routes of Beacon's Rest were second nature to him, and he moved with practiced ease, staying out of sight. The cold air bit at his cheeks as he darted through the shadows, his bag slung over one shoulder. By the time he reached the harbor, the first light of dawn was breaking over the horizon. Nathan's speedboat bobbed gently in the water, its keys waiting where they always were. Elliot climbed aboard, his breath visible in the chilly air. As he started the engine and steered the boat out of the harbor, he cast one last glance at the village behind him. Beacon's Rest was quiet, its lights twinkling faintly in the distance. Turning his gaze forward, he focused on the iceberg ahead, its massive silhouette glowing faintly in the early light. Whatever secrets it held, Elliot was determined to uncover them. The journey to the iceberg was both thrilling and ominous. As Elliot guided the small speedboat closer, the scale of the iceberg became staggering. Its jagged edges and towering peaks seemed almost unreal, like a frozen cathedral carved by the hand of a giant. The sea around it churned lazily, the cold water reflecting the iceberg's brilliant whites and haunting blues. The air grew colder the closer he got, a sharp chill that pierced through his jacket and sent shivers down his spine. As the boat drew near, Elliot slowed the engine, careful not to get too close to the iceberg's base. He knew the dangers lurking below the surface. Massive underwater shelves of ice could destabilize at any moment, sending waves strong enough to capsize a boat. He scanned the iceberg's base, searching for a place to anchor. A narrow outcropping of ice jutted out from one side, forming what looked like a stable landing. Elliot carefully maneuvered the boat alongside it, the hull scraping lightly against the frozen edge. He secured the boat, double-checking the knots on the anchor line. The sheer size of the iceberg loomed over him, its shadow casting him into a surreal twilight despite the early morning sun. Pulling his climbing gear from the boat, Elliot slung the heavy bag over his shoulder and began his approach. Every step was calculated, his boots crunching against the frosty surface as he made his way toward the towering wall of ice. Standing at the base of the iceberg, Elliot craned his neck upward. The summit was obscured by a haze of mist, giving it an almost mythical quality. The sharp ridges and deep crevices of the ice were unlike anything he'd seen before. It was both beautiful and menacing, a reminder of the untamed power of nature. He took a deep breath, the icy air stinging his lungs, and began unpacking his climbing gear. He secured his crampons to his boots, their sharp metal spikes biting into the frozen surface as he tested their grip. Next, he strapped on his harness, threading the ropes through the loops with practiced precision. The weight of the ice axes in his hands felt both reassuring and daunting. This was it, the moment he'd been preparing for. He knew the climb wouldn't be easy, but the mystery of what lay at the summit drove him forward. With a final glance at the boat to ensure it was secure, Elliot plunged his first ice axe into the wall. The sound echoed through the stillness, a sharp crack that seemed to ripple across the iceberg. He placed his foot carefully, driving the crampons into the ice, and began to ascend. The first few meters were relatively straightforward, the surface offering enough texture for secure holds. But as he climbed higher, the challenges quickly mounted. The ice became smoother, almost glass-like in some areas. His crampons struggled to find purchase, and he had to rely more heavily on his ice axes. Each swing required precision and strength, the spikes biting into the ice with a satisfying crunch. His muscles burned with the effort, but he pressed on, pausing occasionally to catch his breath and survey his progress. Below him, the boat looked like a toy, bobbing on the vast expanse of water, and the village of Beacon's Rest was little more than a distant memory. As he climbed, the wind picked up, whipping around him and carrying with it the eerie creaks and groans of the iceberg shifting. The sounds were unsettling, a constant reminder of the iceberg's instability. He tried to push the thought from his mind, focusing instead on the rhythm of his movements. Swing, step, breathe. Every meter gained felt like a small victory, the summit drawing closer with each painstaking effort. Midway through the climb, he encountered his first major obstacle, a deep crevasse that split the ice wall in two. The gap was narrow but treacherous, its depths disappearing into darkness. Elliot paused, considering his options. He could see a narrow ledge on the other side, just wide enough to stand on, but reaching it would require a leap of faith. He tested the security of his ropes, ensuring they were anchored firmly, and prepared himself. With a deep breath, he swung his ice axe into the wall above the crevasse and hoisted himself upward. The edge of the ledge was just within reach. Gathering his strength, he lunged, his body swinging across the gap. His ice axe found its mark, the spike sinking into the ice with a satisfying thunk. For a heart-stopping moment, he dangled above the abyss, the weight of his gear pulling him downward. Gritting his teeth, he pulled himself onto the ledge, his arms trembling with exertion. Elliot leaned against the wall, his chest heaving as he caught his breath. The icy air burned his lungs, but the sense of accomplishment was invigorating. He looked down at the crevasse, its dark depths now a distant threat. This was no longer just a climb. It was a battle against his own limits, a test of his determination and resilience. The higher he climbed, the more surreal the world around him became. The ice glistened like crystal in the sunlight, its intricate patterns a testament to nature's artistry. But the beauty was tempered by the harshness of the environment. The wind grew stronger, biting at his exposed skin and threatening to unbalance him. Snowflakes began to fall, light at first, but steadily increasing in intensity. He knew he had to keep moving. The summit was close, but so was the threat of a storm. Finally, after hours of relentless climbing, Elliot reached a plateau near the summit. He pulled himself over the edge, collapsing onto the flat surface. The icy ground was cold against his body, but he didn't care. He had made it. For a moment, he lay there, his breath clouding the air as he stared up at the sky. The sense of accomplishment was overwhelming, a mix of exhaustion and exhilaration. As he sat up, his gaze swept across the plateau. The summit was still shrouded in mist, its exact peak obscured. But what caught his attention wasn't the view. It was the unmistakable signs of human activity. Footprints, faint but distinct, led across the ice. Nearby, a makeshift shelter constructed from a tarp and ice axes stood partially buried in snow. Scattered around it were tools, ropes, and a small pile of food cans. Elliot's heart raced as he approached the shelter. The sight of human presence so far from civilization was both thrilling and unsettling. Who had been here? And why? The question swirled in his mind as he crouched by the entrance of the shelter. Inside, he found a sleeping bag, weathered but intact, and a small notebook. The pages were filled with notes and sketches, detailing observations about the iceberg's structure and movement. At the bottom of one page, a name was scrawled, Dr. Howard Larson. The realization hit him like a wave. This wasn't just a random campsite. It was the remnants of a scientific expedition. But where was Dr. Larson now? The shelter looked abandoned, the items within untouched for some time. Elliot's curiosity deepened, his mind racing with possibilities. Had Larson left the iceberg, or was he still here, somewhere among its icy labyrinth? As Elliot stood on the plateau, the wind howling around him, he felt a strange mix of emotions. The summit wasn't just a peak, it was a gateway to a deeper mystery, one that went far beyond his initial curiosity. And as he gazed into the mist, he knew his journey was far from over. Elliot lingered by the makeshift shelter, his thoughts racing as he tried to piece together the story of its occupant. The signs of habitation were unmistakable. Someone had lived here, endured the relentless cold and isolation of this frozen expanse. The tarp flapped gently in the wind, its edges weathered and frayed, a silent testament to its struggle against the elements. Inside the shelter, he sifted through the scattered belongings. A metal stove lay overturned, its fuel canister empty. Nearby, a pile of neatly stacked food cans, their labels faded, hinted at careful rationing. Whoever had been here had survived for some time, but had clearly been alone. The notebook was the most intriguing find. Its pages were filled with handwritten notes, diagrams, and sketches. Elliot flipped through them, his breath fogging the air as he read. The entries described the iceberg's size, its unique patterns of movement, and its composition. Scrawled alongside the observations were personal reflections, musings on the isolation, the cold, and the beauty of the frozen wilderness. One particular entry caught his attention. The summit holds more than ice. I am certain of it now. The patterns are unnatural. This is no ordinary iceberg. The cryptic note sent a shiver down Elliot's spine. What did Dr. Larson mean by unnatural patterns? He studied the notebook more closely, but the following pages were either smudged or torn, leaving his questions unanswered. A photograph tucked between two pages fell into his lap. It depicted a man, middle-aged, with a weathered face and kind eyes, standing in front of what appeared to be a research station. Scribbled on the back was the name Dr. Howard Larson. Elliot stared at the photo, a sense of unease growing within him. Was Larson still on the iceberg? If so, where? And if not, what had happened to him? The thought of someone else being here, possibly alive, filled him with equal parts hope and apprehension. The iceberg, silent and vast, now felt less like a natural wonder and more like a puzzle waiting to be solved. Gathering the notebook and the photograph, Elliot decided to search the area further. The footprints leading away from the shelter were faint, partially obscured by fresh snow, but they were there. He followed them cautiously, his ice axe in hand. The wind howled around him, carrying the eerie creaks and groans of the iceberg shifting. The sound was unsettling, like the voice of the iceberg itself warning him to turn back. The footprints led him to a secluded area, a hollow nestled between two towering walls of ice. As he approached, Elliot noticed a glint of metal reflecting in the pale light. He crouched low, moving carefully until he reached the source of the reflection. It was a cluster of scientific instruments, half buried in snow. A battered telescope, a portable weather station, and a stack of geological samples lay scattered as if abandoned in haste. Elliot inspected the equipment, brushing away snow to reveal its details. The telescope's lens was cracked, and the weather station's sensors were damaged, but they had clearly been used for serious research. Nearby, he found another notebook, its cover torn and its pages damp. The entries were written in the same neat handwriting as the first notebook, detailing observations about the iceberg's trajectory and temperature fluctuations. But interspersed with the scientific notes were increasingly erratic comments. "Something is watching. I can feel it. The patterns in the ice, they're not random. I'm not alone." A chill ran down Elliot's spine that had nothing to do with the cold. He glanced around the hollow, his eyes scanning the shadows for any sign of movement. The idea that Larson had felt watched, perhaps even pursued, made the stillness of the iceberg suddenly feel oppressive. What had Larson seen, or thought he had seen, that made him write such things? And where was he now? The sound of crunching snow snapped Elliot out of his thoughts. He froze, his heart pounding as the noise grew louder. It was rhythmic, deliberate, the unmistakable sound of footsteps. Gripping his ice axe tightly, he turned toward the source of the sound, his breath shallow and quick. Through the mist, a figure emerged. At first it was just a shadow, a vague outline that seemed to blend with the icy landscape. But as the figure drew closer, it became clear that it was a man. He moved slowly, his posture hunched against the wind. His clothes were tattered, his face partially obscured by a frost-covered scarf. But his eyes, sharp, bright, and filled with an indomitable spirit, were unmistakable. This was Dr. Howard Larson. Elliot's grip on the ice axe loosened, replaced by a wave of disbelief and relief. "Dr. Larson?" he called out, his voice barely audible over the wind. The man stopped, his eyes narrowing as he studied Elliot. For a moment there was silence between them, the kind of silence that stretches impossibly long in the face of uncertainty. "Yes," Larson finally said, his voice hoarse but firm. "Who are you, and what are you doing here?" Elliot stepped forward, his heart still racing. "I'm Elliot," he said, struggling to find the right words. "I saw the iceberg from my village. I climbed up here to see what was going on. I found your shelter." Larson's expression softened, though his eyes remained wary. "You shouldn't be here," he said, his tone tinged with both caution and resignation. "This place, it's not safe." "I had to know," Elliot said, his voice filled with urgency. "The notes in your notebook, the things you've written, it's like you were seeing something out here, something you couldn't explain." Larson let out a bitter laugh, his breath forming small clouds in the cold air. "You have no idea," he said. "I came here for research, to study this iceberg and its movement. But the deeper I looked, the more questions I found. And the answers..." He trailed off, his gaze shifting to the ice around them. "The answers are harder to face than the questions." Elliot felt a shiver of fear. "What do you mean?" he asked. Before Larson could respond, the wind picked up, carrying with it a low, rumbling groan from deep within the iceberg. Both men turned toward the sound, their unease mirrored in each other's expressions. Larson's face hardened. "Come with me," he said, his tone brooking no argument. "If you've come this far, you deserve to know, but I can't promise you'll like what you find." Without waiting for a response, Larson turned and began walking, his steps deliberate and unhurried. Elliot hesitated for a moment, his instincts warning him to turn back. But the pull of the mystery, the promise of answers, was too strong to resist. Tightening his grip on the ice axe, he followed Larson into the mist, toward the unknown. Elliot followed Dr. Larson through the swirling mist, his pulse pounding in his ears as they navigated the icy labyrinth. The rumbling sound from deep within the iceberg echoed intermittently, a low, resonant groan that seemed almost alive. Larson moved with purpose, his steps sure and deliberate despite the treacherous terrain. He carried a small pack slung over one shoulder, its faded fabric betraying years of wear. Elliot trailed behind, his eyes darting to the shadows, every shift in the mist amplifying his growing unease. "Where are we going?" Elliot asked, his voice barely audible over the rising wind. Larson didn't stop. "There's something you need to see, something I never intended for anyone else to witness." The cryptic reply sent a chill down Elliot's spine. The environment grew harsher as they descended into a narrow gorge carved into the iceberg. The walls of ice loomed on either side, their smooth glassy surfaces reflecting faint glimmers of light from above. Every step seemed to take them deeper into the heart of the frozen giant. The cold intensified, sharp and biting, as if the air itself resisted their intrusion. Larson finally stopped at the mouth of a cavern, its entrance partially obscured by a ridge of ice. He turned to Elliot, his expression grim. "This is where I stopped being a scientist," he said, his voice heavy with regret. "What lies beyond here defies reason. I've spent days trying to understand it, but all I've found is more questions." Elliot felt a lump in his throat as he stared into the dark opening. "What is it?" he asked, his curiosity warring with a growing sense of dread. "Come," Larson said simply, stepping into the cavern. Elliot hesitated for a moment before following. Inside, the air was eerily still, the sound of the wind outside replaced by a deep, almost oppressive silence. The walls of the cavern shimmered faintly, their icy surfaces refracting light in subtle, kaleidoscopic patterns. It was beautiful, but there was something unnerving about the perfection of the space. The ice seemed too smooth, too symmetrical, as though it had been shaped intentionally. They moved deeper into the cavern, the light growing dimmer with each step. Larson produced a small flashlight from his pack, its beam cutting through the darkness to reveal more of the cavern's uncanny interior. The walls were marked with strange grooves and patterns, their shapes resembling neither natural formations nor human craftsmanship. Elliot reached out to touch one of the grooves, his fingers brushing against the cold surface. It felt impossibly smooth, almost metallic beneath his fingertips. "These patterns," Larson said, his voice echoing softly. "They weren't formed by the ice. I don't know how to explain it, but they're not natural, and they're not recent." "What do you mean?" Elliot asked, his voice hushed. Larson turned to face him, his expression a mix of wonder and fear. "This iceberg isn't just a piece of ice. It's ancient. I've dated samples of it, and the readings don't make sense. Some parts are tens of thousands of years old, but others, they're older than the last ice age." "Much older?" Elliot stared at him, struggling to process what he was hearing. "You think this is... what? Some kind of artifact?" Larson hesitated before replying. "I think it's more than that. I think it's a fragment of something we don't understand, something that predates humanity. And I think it's waking up." The words hung in the air, heavy and foreboding. Before Elliot could respond, another rumble shook the cavern, this time much louder. The ground beneath their feet vibrated, and a faint blue light pulsed from deeper within the ice. Larson's flashlight flickered, and both men froze, their breath visible in the freezing air. "What was that?" Elliot whispered, his voice trembling. Larson tightened his grip on the flashlight, his knuckles white. "It's been happening more frequently. At first, I thought it was just the ice shifting, but it's not. It's something else." They continued forward, the cavern narrowing as they descended further. The blue light pulsed again, stronger this time, illuminating the walls in brief, brilliant flashes. The patterns etched into the ice seemed to glow, their intricate designs becoming more complex as they moved deeper. Elliot felt a growing sense of unease, his instincts screaming at him to turn back, but he pressed on, unable to resist the pull of the mystery. Finally, the passage opened into a vast chamber, its ceiling soaring high above them. In the center of the room stood an enormous structure, partially encased in ice. It was unlike anything Elliot had ever seen. An intricate lattice of sharp angles and curved edges, its surface shimmering with the faint blue light that pulsed rhythmically from within. The structure seemed almost alive, its glowing patterns shifting and changing like veins carrying an otherworldly current. Elliot stared in stunned silence. What? What is that? Larson stepped forward, his voice low and reverent. I don't know. I've studied it for days, but I can't even begin to understand it. It's not made of ice. It's not even made of anything I can identify. The readings from my instruments were off the charts, and then they stopped working altogether. Elliot approached the structure cautiously, the hair on the back of his neck standing on end. The air around it felt charged, like the moments before a lightning strike. He reached out, but Larson grabbed his arm, stopping him. Don't touch it, Larson warned. I tried once. The moment I made contact, I blacked out. When I woke up, I was outside the cavern, and I couldn't remember how I got there. The implications of Larson's words sank in, and Elliot stepped back, his mind racing. Do you think it's alive? Larson hesitated, his gaze fixed on the structure. I think it's a remnant of something that was alive, or maybe it's waiting to be alive again. Whatever it is, it's beyond anything we've ever encountered. Another pulse of blue light filled the chamber, brighter and more intense than before. The ground trembled, and a sharp cracking sound echoed through the air. Larson's expression turned grim. We need to leave, now! Elliot nodded, his fear finally overtaking his curiosity. The two men turned and began retracing their steps, the rumbling growing louder and more frequent. The cavern seemed to shift around them, the walls creaking and groaning, as though the iceberg itself were responding to the structure's awakening. They moved as quickly as they could, their breath coming in short, panicked gasps. As they emerged into the open air, the wind howled fiercely, carrying with it a flurry of snow. The iceberg shuddered beneath their feet, and Elliot realized with a sinking feeling that it was beginning to break apart. Larson pointed toward the ridge where Elliot had anchored his boat. We have to get to the water, he shouted over the roar of the wind. They sprinted across the ice, dodging falling chunks and widening fissures. The boat came into view, rocking violently in the choppy waters. Elliot scrambled aboard, untying the ropes as Larson climbed in behind him. The engine roared to life, and they sped away from the iceberg just as a massive section collapsed into the sea, sending waves rippling outward. Elliot glanced back at the iceberg, its once majestic form now crumbling into chaos. The faint blue light pulsed one final time before disappearing, leaving only the cold, gray mist in its wake. As the boat sped toward the safety of the shore, Elliot and Larson sat in silence, their minds struggling to process what they had witnessed. The iceberg was gone, but its mystery remained, a mystery that would haunt them both for the rest of their lives.